Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Princeton Public Library, both for those here in person and those joining us via live stream on YouTube. My name is Janie Herman, and I'm the manager of adult programming here at Princeton Public Library. It's my great pleasure to introduce our author for this morning's book brunch on what is a gorgeous late spring, almost summer morning. But first, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology, and if you need hearing assistance and do not have a T-coil device, headphones are available for your use. We kindly ask that you silence your electronic devices during the talk and that you hold your questions, as there will be a chance for audience question and answer at the end of the presentation. And there will also be a book signing following the presentation. We keep this short because I know we have a really great speaker here today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our author, who will be speaking about her recently released book, The Wreck, a daughter's memoir of becoming a mother. So Cassandra Jackson is our speaker. She is a professor of English at the College of New Jersey, where she teaches classes about African literature and visual culture. She is the co-author of the Toni Morrison Book Club, which was released in very early 2020. Now, it was during the tour for the Toni Morrison Book Club when I first met Cassandra, as she and her three co-authors appeared at a big event for our Library Live at Labyrinth series that we do with Labyrinth Books. And this was in the basement of Labyrinth Books on the evening of Thursday, March 5th, 2020. The next day, the world shut down. Yeah, that's why. The event was memorable for two reasons. One is that it was a fantastic panel discussion. There was a lot of joy in the air. Everybody was loving the book. But that was also the final in-person event that the library and Labyrinth would host for many, many months, as it was the next day, as I said, that the world shut down. So I'm so glad that we can gather in person once again to celebrate authors in general and Cassandra in particular, and that their books can be gathered. We can gather in our community to celebrate reading at events like this. So Cassandra Jackson has also published two books on race in U.S. literature and art, and she has written about racial oppression in everyday life in publications such as HuffPost and the Washington Post. She lives right here in New Jersey with her husband and two children, and we are thrilled to welcome her to the library today to talk about her memoir. Welcome, Cassandra.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. Thank you to Labyrinth for collaborating with you on this event. I appreciate it so much. Now you know why I appreciate it so much. That book came out in like spring of 2020 and did a couple events, and that was it. So I'm really grateful to be able to do these in-person events, because I feel like for writers, this is the moment you really get to be in community with others. And I'm especially happy whenever I can give a reading at a library. In part because I do feel like, whenever you're in a room full of people who are there to talk about books, I think we need to keep in mind that there are so many people who wouldn't be in that room had it not been for public libraries. These were the doors that I went through to become like a writer. It wasn't as fancy as this library, obviously, but being public libraries, and I feel like, I know you don't make this public service announcement in here, but maybe somebody out there on YouTube does, but we have to defend our libraries, protect our libraries. Librarians and their staff are the best people in the world. They have led the way in terms of accessibility and making it possible for so many people to enter the world of books. It defined me, and so I'm always grateful to be able to do any event in a library space, because they always feel like home. They always feel like home. So I wanted to say, now that I've preached to you about supporting your library, I wanted to say, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the book is about, but I want to read a little bit from maybe like a paragraph first, and then I'm going to open up and talk a little bit. Oh, and I'm tall. And I am tall. And then what I'll do is I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book as well. I can find all these tabs, and none of them are in the right place as usual. So. Got it. I am 6 years old and standing next to a gravestone with my name on it. The A little girl with my name is buried here, along with her mom, who was my father's sister, and her dad. There were others who died in the wreck too. Some who are buried here, and some who are buried at the other cemetery that looks just like this one. I cannot keep up with all the dead people. I am not sure how many there are because I have never heard anyone list all their names at once or tick them off on their fingers one by one. I do not ask what happened to the girl because I already know what my father will say. The same thing he said when I asked why I have just one grandmother, the wreck. I try hard to imagine this thing called wreck. I see toy race cars in the hands of a giant toddler who bangs them together, stretching the word wreck into a sound effect. But the bodies, I cannot picture what happens to the bodies. In my mind, they transform instantly into something glittery, like the floating orb that turns into Glinda, the Good Witch, and the Wizard of Oz. But that cannot be true because the bodies are here in the red dirt under our feet. So I want to tell you a little bit about what the book is about, and then I'll read a little bit more in a few minutes. So the book is about a period when two parts of my life collided. I was trying and failing to get pregnant, and dealing with all of this ambiguous grief around that, right? Because we don't have ceremonies for those kinds of losses, right? There's no real finality. And I noticed that feeling was oddly familiar to me, and that I had grown up with a feeling of ambiguous grief in my household. And it was largely because my father had lost his whole family in an accident before I was born, and significantly before I was born, actually. He had lost his mother, his sister, his wife, his brother-in-law, and his niece in a single car accident that happened in Alabama in 1960. And we didn't talk at all about what happened. I couldn't have told you, I couldn't have named exactly who the relatives were. I couldn't have told you where it happened or when, but it was incredibly present with us in our day-to-day lives in ways that I think would be hard for people outside of our household to even imagine. In fact, sometimes it felt like we were living a kind of secret life in a way. Because it was so present with us, even in the silence about it, right? It took up a lot of space in our home. And, it was during that period of time when I was going in and out of these infertility clinics, which also feels like kind of living a secret life, right? You go at the, crack of dawn, you give blood, and you go back and forth. I see people nodding. There are people who know this experience, right? And I remember it was during that period of time that I started giving a lot of thought to this question of like, wait, what happened to our family? So it was as I'm trying to make a family that I began thinking about this lost family, and feeling like I needed to know more. And I knew I had to go back to Alabama at that point and find out the secret of what had happened there. And it was in that process, which was quite a journey in and of itself, but it was in that process that I began noticing these parallels between what my family encountered in a segregated healthcare system and what I was navigating in terms of as a Black woman trying to get pregnant and using healthcare to do that. And it shouldn't have been surprising, right? Because obviously, our healthcare system that we have now is one that we're living in the fallout, right, of a Jim Crow healthcare system. It's not like everybody just sort of burned everything down, dusted off their hands and moved on and said, let's build a new healthcare system. There are all these ways in which we're still living with a system that was actually never intended to be equitable in the first place, right? And so part of what I was experiencing, in some ways my frustration with what was happening to me, was paralleled by some of the things that happened after that accident. And we can talk more about that later, but I do want to say to you that the first doctor that I saw basically dismissed me entirely and said, well, you're Black, you couldn't possibly be infertile. I love that always gets a gasp because I should have gasped when it happened and I didn't, in part because I grew up my whole life with this myth of Black women as hyperfertile. And I also, it was in such a vulnerable position because I just really wanted to believe that could be true. Even though I obviously knew better, I did want it to be true, and it wasn't, obviously. And so part of this experience was about, sort of understanding, what it means to be navigating in a healthcare system that was never meant for you in the first place. I'm gonna read.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I'm gonna read a little bit from chapter 8 in the book. Okay, finding the text in the right place. Let's do this. Before I was born, my mother lived in a dead woman's house, slept in a dead woman's bed, ate at a dead woman's table, and drank from a dead woman's cups. In 1961, she married my father, then a 20-year-old widower. She was 23 years old and already pregnant with my brother, who would turn out to be born 3 months later. My mother moved into the house that my father had shared with his wife and parents. She bought new things for the house, but nothing could rid it of its ghost. My father had gotten rid of nothing but clothes. The rest of the dead women's things were everywhere. Their quilts tumbled out of closets, cups stained by their lipstick sat in the cupboard, while a broom still thick with the dust they swept stood nearby. The baby boy in my mother's belly was supposed to change things, make everything new. But those hopes were dashed when the baby ended up being delivered by the same doctor who had told my father that his first wife was dead. The couple struggled to find a new house to rent, but few owners were willing to rent to Black people. They saved and bought a plot of land in one of the few neighborhoods where they were allowed to buy. There, they built a new house that was supposed to be theirs alone. But when the time came to move in, they brought the old things with them. They packed up plates, quilts, whiskey, and sundry other things. My mother put the old glasses in her new cupboard, including one so jagged that it once tore open the lip of a guest. She hid the photos in the boxes and put the quilts in the attic. My father needed the whiskey to live, so she left it in a cabinet next to the bleach and ammonia, as if these chemicals could strip the alcohol of its power. Then she went about filling the rest of the home with things she deemed beautiful and luxurious, hoping their novelty and value might overshadow the power of the past. In the end, the house was too small for a living family and a dead one. So they built another house across the street, sitting on a hill overlooking the old one. The new house was bigger and better, with wall-to-wall carpet, a formal dining room with a chandelier, a den for everyday living, and an elegant living room that no one used. The Black people they knew admired the house, and so did my parents. But in no time, the dust of the past settled on this new house too. I am 10 years old, lying on the carpet of our den watching television. Behind me, my father snores with an empty glass next to him. My mother, who is sitting on the sofa, puts her newspaper down and approaches him. She whispers his name and waits to see if he will wake up. She calls him again, this time louder. He startles, opens his eyes, and mumbles something, but then his eyelids close again. This is how he sleeps when he has been drinking, talking with eyes that open as if he can see us, but he cannot. Half of him, the unconscious body, is here with us. His mind is somewhere else, navigating a world made of second chances, where Sam, the dead girl, is still alive, and he can save her. And I should tell you that, it occurs to me, I forgot to mention this earlier, I am named for the child who died in the accident. So my parents also call me San, and she is also called San. And you got a little bit of that when I mentioned the gravestone earlier, but that's why my name was already on the gravestone, because we shared a name. Yeah, his mind is somewhere else, navigating a world made of second chances, where Sam, the dead girl, is still alive, and he can save her, and if he can save her, he can save them all, the family who died. No one in my family talks about how scary my father is in his sleep. Instead, my mother and I make a game of what we can do to him as he dozes. My mother can tap on the crown of his head, and I can braid and decorate his hair with bows, and we can all laugh at how silly he looks. This is easier than looking into his bloodshot eyes, wondering if he sees me or the dead girl looking back at him. I half expect him to call her name, my name now. But he turns his head to the side and his mouth goes slack. My mother laughs and walks to the garage where she hides all the household goods that she buys. The trunk of her car is like a magician's hat, mysteriously containing a never-ending parade of vases, fake flower arrangements, paintings, side tables, and curtains. She returns carrying a package so large that I cannot see her face as she walks past my father toward the bedroom. A few minutes later, she calls my name in a loud whisper. "Come see," she says. I follow her to her room where she points at a maroon bedspread trimmed in a silky gold rope with matching pillow shams. "Isn't it beautiful?" she says. I nod, unwilling to tell her that the new bedspread with its gold tassels and antique print looks just like the old one, except for one difference. The shiny pleated maroon border on this new one looks like the liner inside a casket. The next morning is Saturday, and my father wakes and yells my mother's name. She cannot hear him because she is in the garage digging through the trunk. I get out of bed and run halfway to him, but turn back for the garage when I realize that he is awake and angry. He has probably figured out that the bedspread is new. I go to the door that leads to the garage just as my mother walks in carrying a painting. "Daddy is calling you," I say. "I hear him," she says as she walks into the dining room and hides the painting behind the door. She dusts her hands off and walks toward the bedroom. I follow her down the hallway while my father continues to call her name. She opens the door to their bedroom, but does not close it behind her, leaving me standing in the open doorway as she walks in. My father is waving his hand at a lamp on the nightstand. "What is this?" he says. "I told you not to buy nothing else. We just can't." He hesitates and looks at me and back at my mother. "You know what I told you about my job, and you just keep on buying new stuff." "That lamp," she says, "it's not new. It's been there for 6 months." My father stares at the lamp as if it has spoken some gibberish from the planet of the lamps and shakes his head. "You telling a story? You just bought that lamp." My mother lets out a genuine laugh and rolls her eyes. "It's been there for 6 months and you didn't even notice." She is telling the truth. I can remember when she carted the lamp into the house and plugged it in. She turns to walk out, still laughing. "It was on sale back then, like it would matter now anyway." My father runs his hand along the brass-colored stem of the lamp as if touching it will tell him when and how it arrived at this spot in his house. I almost tell him that the bedspread that covers him and the throw pillows next to him are the things that are new, and that if he looks in his wife's trunk, he'll find new bath rugs, brass goblets, and a small plant stand, all waiting for their turn to sneak into the house. But if I tell him, we can no longer make a joke of his drunken sleep. I will have to talk about the things that we do not talk about. The times when he opens his eyes and seems to look at me, but he is really looking through me like I am a magnifying glass. How the stillness of his eyes scares me, because he looks like he is neither dead nor alive. We'll have to admit that the whiskey is a doorway to another girl named Sam. And then when he is with her, he is yelling at her to stop whatever she is doing that might make her die. I'm afraid that if I wake him, me and this other Sam will collide. That for a moment between a dream and real time, I will become the one who is about to die. What difference does a bedspread make to someone who is trying to stop death in his dreams? So the book moves back and forth in time. So I'm going to give you a little warning. I was really interested in forms. So if there are writers here and you want to talk about that, we certainly can during the Q&A, because the form of the book was really influenced by this idea that various forms of grief often collapse time, meaning that you have one grief experience and you find yourself reflecting on these other grief experiences as a way of understanding that one. And so it ends up being a kind of very sort of circular experience. And so the book kind of reflects that in the ways in which it kind of plays around with chronology. On the 9th day after the embryo was transferred to my body, I go to the IVF clinic for a pregnancy blood test. 8 hours later, my phone rings. I answer and a voice says, "I'm sorry, your pregnancy test was negative." I thank her
in that way that one thanks a funeral director for making arrangements, polite but absent. Grief slices through me, intense and unexpected, and my body freezes against a wall. When I can breathe again, I call Reginald, my husband, to tell him that I am not pregnant. He tells me how sorry he is, and I tell him I am too, but I say it as if this is all my fault, my body's fault. I'll come home as soon as I can, he says. I nod, as if he can see me, and hang up. I go to my bedroom and climb into my bed while light streams in through the windows. I shroud myself in my bedspread and wail like something is eating my entrails. A dreamless sleep takes over my body until Reginald's footsteps wake me. He sits on the edge of the bed and tells me again how sorry he is. I think of that phrase, sorry for your loss, and realize that no one existed for me to lose. One day, there were tiny cells dividing, and another day, I don't even know exactly when, they stopped. Reginald is trying to talk about what we have been through, about how hard all of this has been. As he searches for words for what has happened to us, he lands on miscarriage. I sit up in bed and cut him off, as if some mean spirit will hear this and wish miscarriage on us too. This was not a miscarriage. You have to be pregnant to have a miscarriage. We were never pregnant. A strange poem plays on my head on repeat. I did not have a baby. I had an embryo. I did not lose a baby. I lost an embryo. I cannot grieve a baby because all I had was an embryo. I tell him about a cousin who miscarried many times when she was still in her 20s. Each time her belly grew round, someone would have to rush her to a hospital. Once, as a little girl at a family get-together, I had ridden along on one of these hospital trips. I sat in a waiting room with my mother and her sisters while a doctor explained to my aunt that my cousin would be okay, but the baby had died. We waited for hours while my cousin pushed a dead baby into the world. Technically, this was a stillbirth, but everyone I knew called losses like this one miscarriage, a word that hides the fact that dead babies demand the strength of their mother's birth canals to enter the world, just like living babies do. Miscarriage was not the word for what I had experienced, but neither could it describe what my cousin had been through. Her loss was given the wrong name. Mine had no name at all. Reginald squints as he searches for a better word for losing someone who never existed. For him, loss must have a name because names separate experiences from the people who have them. A name could make our vague loss singular, something that happened in real time with a beginning and an end. He lets out a soft puff of air and presses his lips together, but his eyes dart about as if the right word might be written somewhere on the walls of our bedroom. I lean my head back on a pillow. I do not need a word for what I am feeling because I know it is not a thing separate from me. The grief of losing that which I have never known feels like coming home, devastating and familiar as the stink of Old Forester whiskey. I am 7 years old and sick with the flu. I lie on a sofa in the den with the TV blaring, even though I am not watching it. My mother climbs down from the attic carrying a quilt. She stands over me and spreads the quilt in the air. The rich smell of cedar hits me before the quilt lands on my body. Blues, peaches, and maroons cover me in star patterns, each one soft, precise, and mathematical. Your daddy's mama made all these quilts we got, my mother says. All these little pieces are scraps left over from their clothes that she sewed. Years later, when I am in my early 20s, I will ask my mother to save these quilts for me. But as I lie under the quilt at age 7, it is not yet an object to ask for because it is not separate from me. While my mother disappears into her room, the quilt's heaviness sinks into me. I sweat and shiver, drifting and waking to the colors of my grandmother's clothes. So I'll stop here for a second because I wanted to mention to you too that while I never knew my grandmother, I never met my grandmother, obviously she died before I was born, but she really lived on in our imaginations in that whenever extended family came, she was all they talked about. It didn't matter what funeral they were coming for. All they talked about was her. And part of the reason they talked about her so much was she was not good at following the rules of Jim Crow is how I'm going to put it. And so She often had, in some cases, like very precisely and sometimes flagrantly, challenged those rules. And she had usually done so on behalf of her children. So the stories they would tell were really about these often what seemed like crazy things that she had done in the defense of her children in the context of Jim Crow. So she was, oddly enough, like through those stories, she was a mother figure without ever having been there. I'm 8 when I find the photograph of a little black girl in a small brass frame hidden in the bottom of a side table drawer. I ask my father who she is. At first he says that she is my cousin Sam, and then he blinks hard and shakes his head. No, that's her mama, my sister Maggie Jo. Both of them died in the wreck. I stared at the slightly buck-toothed, smiling 3-year-old wearing a hair bow that is too big for her head. Her cheeks have been tinted pink by a heavy-handed photographer, and she leans as if she is about to leap forward. Her eyes are like mine, except that they show more joy than I can ever remember feeling. I prop up the photo on the end table, but in a few days, it goes missing. I look in the drawer of the table, and there I find Maggie Jo face down, pressed against the bottom of the drawer under the stacks of junk mail and receipts. I return her to the table, and she stays there for a week before she disappears again. I put her back. Someone, probably my mother, and I go back and forth like this for weeks, with Maggie Jo getting buried in the drawer and me resurrecting her. The last time I noticed that the girl is missing from the table, I open the drawer and dig to the bottom, but she is really gone, this time for good. I spend the days after the nurse called to tell me I am not pregnant in bed. On the 3rd day, I bleed and ache as if passing clotted blood is my only job. I lie in my bed trying to read to forget my body, but grief as powerful as blood water overtakes me, and I surrender. I drown, except I imagine I can hear my father's voice calling me home. I want to tell him a truth that is also a lie, that I am experiencing a loss, not of a person, but the idea of someone who would be connected to our bodies by blood. And just the thought of telling him such a thing makes me ashamed of myself for even briefly letting my grief overlap with his. But the rolling waters of his loss and mine have already mixed, and I have no way to completely separate them. Perhaps his loss was always also mine. I feel the pink walls of my childhood bedroom close over me like an envelope. Like my name, I am a haunted thing. Desire takes root in a twisted spot in my belly, replacing grief with a question that can be answered. What hellish catastrophe was hidden behind that phrase, the wreck? What exactly happened to our family who died and to the ones who grieved them? And just as I commit to the unearthing, I realize that I don't even know how or where to dig. I know almost nothing, not even when or where the wreck happened. My fingers dial my father before I know how to say what I want from him. In my mind, he walks to the old corded mustard yellow phone of my childhood and answers, "Hey, baby." The soft joy in his voice startles me back into the present. I am in a bed bleeding. My father is almost a thousand miles away in Alabama. I can hear the fuzzy sound of the cordless phone that replaced the phone of my childhood. Feel him smiling at a new world he made from ruins. I cannot snatch him back to his hellish dreams, nor am I ready to bear witness to his pain. I collect myself, and instead of asking him to relive the worst day of his life, I ask him for a quilt. "What quilts are you talking about?" he says. "You know, the ones your mom made, the ones we always had." "I don't think we ever had any of those," he says. "My sister Judy took all of them way back then. Let me get your mama. You can ask her what you're thinking of." My mother gets on the phone. "The quilts," she says. "We never had those. The ones you kept in the attic, you used to get them out when I was sick." "Nah," she says. "You must have been thinking of something else. You had a little baby blanket that my mama made, but no quilts." I keep talking as if I can make her remember until I realize that she does not want to remember. So I ask for the only other thing I can think of, photographs of my father's mother, sister, and niece. Days later, the photos printed on thick construction paper arrive in a brown envelope. One is a photograph of my grandmother that I've seen many times. On another sheet is a photo of my Aunt Maggie's daughter, Sam, who died, and Liza, who survived. And on the last page is the green tinted photo of as a little pop-eyed girl who kept disappearing from my parents' end table. Above the photo, my mother has written my father's sister's name, Maggie Jo. I prop each photo on my dresser next to a row of infertility drugs, the relics of death, and the thin promise of new life. I wake up to those photos for 1 week before I call my father again. I will not wait for him to call me baby. I will sit with the softest question I can think of under my tongue, letting it spring out as soon as he speaks. Hello? Daddy, can I ask you a question about the wreck? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take questions. I have a microphone, and I'll just come around if you want to raise your hand and have a question for Cassandra. No need to be shy.
You can take your time.
Oh, here we have one right
Am I
here.
on?
Right.
Am I on? Hang on, let me just check. Button on the side. Yeah, you should be. The last library I went to, I just shouted anyway, so I don't know why I'm asking about this, but yeah.
Hi, you sort of alluded that your experience with IVF was what triggered you to write the book. I'm wondering if there were ever a time before that you thought about writing a book about this situation, like if it ever popped in your head at all? Just because it seems like such a large part of your childhood, and as a writer.
I love that question, because now I have to sit here and think about why it didn't. And, there's a scene in the book when I was really little, and I think, you become a writer so early, and I had started writing, trying to write a series of books in the style of R.A. Equals Wilder when I was in 4th grade. My mother was quite the storyteller, and she would always tell these stories about her childhood. And I had kind of built on some of those stories, and I remember being very excited about it and running to her when I had finished the first one to say, look at this, look at what I wrote. And she says, what it's about? I said, it's kind of like, about your life and your childhood. And she lived that, and it was, for her, there are things that you don't talk about, period, but there are also things that you don't talk about outside your home. And I think that was a real block for me, in the sense that I did not feel, I wasn't even sure if it was fully my story to tell. Like, I think I was still processing the ways in which it was my story too, as well. But I just remember, I'm probably a writer because she got so mad. I'm gonna point that out. Like, I understood there was power in this thing. When your mother freaks out like that, it means something. But I also think that it really wasn't until I was experiencing infertility and started thinking more about life and legacy and what it actually means to have children. And also just the ways in which my own family and my father had moved on for reproduction, which is something that's pretty common, I think, in a lot of families, but especially African-American families and families who don't have access to certain kinds of therapies. Remember, it's 1960. If you're a Black man in 1960, you experience a trauma. What do you do? Where do you go? Who do you talk to about that, right? And especially when your whole family has experienced the same trauma. So no, I don't think I really felt like I could do it until then. Because that was the period of time that made me start recognizing, like, wait, this is my story too. And my mother didn't agree with that. but I came to kind of an understanding that it was. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Just a follow-up on that, on the writing process. So after, you began to ask questions, what were the interviews like? Did you collect the oral history? Did you tape the interviews? How did that go with your mother and your father? I imagine they're different. And have you preserved those, the tapes, if you took any? Or
Yeah, it was difficult. So I started out by talking to my father on the phone about what had happened to see how much he could talk about it. And what I discovered is that he really had a limit in terms of how much he could revisit that. And we were at the end of one of these conversations one day, and he said to me, you know, it was all in the newspaper. And I was like, the newspaper? No one had ever mentioned anything about this being in newspapers. He was like, yes, it was a very bad accident. It was all in the newspaper. I don't know how you would get them, but you can get them. And I got on a plane and went to Alabama, and I went to the local library to look at those newspapers. And it was interesting because I was expecting to do that work alone. I would never have asked him to do that work with me. And I got up in the morning after I flew in at night. I got up in the morning, I'm getting ready to go to the library, and my dad, he's the person who made breakfast every day. He's making breakfast, and he's all dressed, and he's like, all right, let's get him to the library. I was like, wait a second. I said, no, you don't need to go to the library. He's like, no, I want to take it down there. I'll take it down there. And he did the research with me. So I write about that in the book, like what it meant, because he had actually never looked at those newspapers. So I was with him when he was looking at those newspapers for the first time. And as you would imagine, it was devastating on so many levels. I remember it being very difficult for me, in part because as an academic and a person who so much of my work is focused on race, I felt like I should have been more prepared for what I would encounter, and everything was shocking. Like everything was shocking. So looking at the local newspaper, this is a paper that I briefly worked at years ago as an intern, and just realizing how much journalism was shaped by white supremacy in that moment. So much so that we take out the articles, and I'm realizing that you couldn't print the names of the Black victims before the names of any white victims who were also in the accident, right? So all the white names are listed, and they're always listed as Mr. and Mrs. And then all the Black names come after that with no honorific in front of them, right? And then comma, Negro, so that no white person would pick up the newspaper and think the person that they knew died, oh, that was a Negro, right? And so it goes, and it was, so I was in a bit of shock and sort of recognizing in that moment that this was not just about the personal loss, that this was also about the humiliations that Black people experience, even in the context of grief and loss. And so, and because he had never looked at the newspapers, he didn't know how the accident was recorded. His mother knew that it couldn't be recorded in papers the way that it happened, and she spent a lot of time telling him afterwards. She survived for 10 days. So what happens is he gets to the hospital, and the doctors tell him that his family, the ones who are still alive, will stay alive, but they end up dying one by one. All but his father and one of his nieces. And so obviously he wasn't picking up a newspaper during this time, but he was also in the process of like planning multiple funerals while this was happening. And so one of the things we had to do is I needed the obituaries because I was trying to confirm the dates. I was trying to figure out who lived, how long, and match it up with their death certificate and understand like how that person dies. Like one person dies in surgery, this other person, you know, and it's complicated by the fact that if you're in an accident in 1960 and you're Black, it's your fault. It doesn't really matter what happened because you were supposed to give the right of way to any white person who needed. So the account that's in the newspaper is very different, as you would imagine, from my grandmother's account of what had happened. And even my husband was reading over the newspaper at one point. He said, this doesn't actually make sense. He was like, the physics of this is not possible. And I was like, I don't think that it mattered whether or not it was possible. That was the way that it would have been reported no matter what happened. And just, you know, but it was really in that process of, at one point I was looking for those obituaries, I mentioned that earlier, and realized we couldn't find them. And I was like, how can these obituaries not be here? So we're going through every obituary section around that time, and a man who was in the, he was one of those library dudes, you know, those guys who are like, they chill in the library all the time, just sort of reading every newspaper that ever was. And he could hear us and me becoming rather frustrated at not being able to find them. And I was really confused. And he said, he was like, excuse me, ma'am. He's like, is the person y'all are looking for African American? And I was like, well, yes. And he said to me, he said, okay, well, you would have to find those obituaries in the Black section of the newspaper. And there was a section called News About Negroes. And it was the only place that you could report the death of a Black person, the funeral of a Black person, the wedding of a Black person, everything that happened to a Black person, right, had to be, unless they were accused of a crime, because that was the rest of the newspaper. Every other page of the newspaper would say, Black people, they kept claiming that Black people were like peeping. It was just bizarre. And then all the weddings, and that was the only place in the newspaper where Black people were called by Mr. and Mrs. as well, right? Because it was written, the section would be written by a Black woman. But what that meant was that if something, it only came out on Thursday. So if you died on Saturday and you were buried before Thursday, your burial would have to be reported after the fact, right? You would have to get the word out a different way because it couldn't be in the newspaper, and that's why we had such a hard time finding them. So yeah, it was a crazy process, and like I thought I knew so much going into this, and I was like, wow, I don't know anything. Like wrote those 2 books and still didn't know anything, because it was incredibly, everything was determined by the rules of white supremacy, including if you're in an accident and you have to wait for the colored ambulance. And you can't be taken necessarily to the closest hospital. You have to go to a hospital that treats colored people. And so, yeah, it was quite a process. So yes, I did a lot of research, and it was, a lot of it was just shocking. Yeah, shocking. Yes.
Oh, hang on.
Thank you so much for the book. I have 2 questions for you. Let's follow up. First one is, since you wrote the memoir, were there points in times where you felt that you couldn't disclose some information, were too personal, or you will offend somebody by saying too much? Did you have the struggle in checking what can I say and what can I not say? And secondly, just a second question, that since you are an academician now, and you still have your father is still living? Is he still living?
No, he passed away in 2018.
The question is that how do you correct the narratives? Since you have something in your hands that a lived experience actually had a true story, don't ignore that. How do you correct the narratives to have maybe a book written about that says exactly what happened?
Wait, say the last part. A book that says
About what you're saying about the differences in narration, the narrative. How do you correct that? History has to be corrected somewhere or the other, or informed.
That's such a great question. Both of them are great questions. Okay, so about the other people, basically saying too much. I kind of had to make a decision if I was going to write the book, that I was going to just tell the truth. And but it was very concerning. I still worry about it to this day. A cousin reached out to me recently, who is mentioned in the book, because he was at the house on the day of the wreck, and he didn't get to go because there were too many people in the car. And so he stayed behind, and he was told, my grandmother told him, I'm going to bring you some strawberries. Thank you for bringing so much. I'm going to bring you strawberries. And of course, they never came back. And he's never eaten a strawberry to this day. And I was very worried about that. And it's interesting because not so much for myself, because once you start writing your personal experience of trying to get pregnant, you have already told everything there is to tell about you at that point. So the beginning of the book is a series of at-home disgusting experiments that my husband and I were trying to do to get pregnant. So I wasn't as worried about it for myself. And I think part of that, some of the freedom of being able to write without worry also comes from being an academic and a scholarly writer. Because when you're writing as a scholar and as a professor, I don't ever expect anybody to read anything. I assume that 3 people might see this. And so it does make you write with a lot of freedom in a way, because you're not ever thinking, I don't think as much about how it will live in the world as I think about the process of writing it. So that helps. But it wasn't until we were nearing the end of the process and my editor said, have you talked to your mom about this book? I said, no. And she, and part of the reason I had talked to her about it too is because years ago when I was calling and asking these questions, she was not very happy about me calling and talking to my dad about this stuff. It was very hard for her because in her mind,
this was a slippery slope. Like, I could take him back to another time. He was no longer drinking. He was like living a very, healthy life by the time I'm asking him these questions. And she did not want to go back in time. She was like, you leave the past where it is, leave, well enough alone. But I wasn't well enough. I really needed to have that conversation. It was important to me. But yeah, there were times I called and she'd be like, he's not here. And I could hear him. It's stuff that only your mother can do. And so one time she got on the phone, after I'd asked him some questions, she got on the phone and she said, what are you doing? You're not writing a book, are you? I was like, no. I was like, no, I just need to know, because there was just, at that point, there was no point in telling her. But the question was like, when do you say, oh, this is what I'm doing? My father knew about the book. It was one of the last conversations we had before he died, was about this book, because it was okay with him. And it was really like, that was a big concern. It was a really big concern. And so the thing that I was expecting that people would be angry with me about something that I told. But honestly, what has actually happened is that people have thanked me, including family members, because they too were living with the silence around it. And also people I don't know have thanked me, in part because it creates an opportunity to talk about secrets in their family as well. So that for me has been surprising and really sort of powerful, because I only thought about what could go wrong. I did not think, oh, well, what are the ways in which you might connect with people differently by putting yourself, in this very vulnerable position and putting your work out there. So that it's actually been incredibly gratifying in ways that were surprising, thank goodness. Still not saying I might go to Alabama and walk into a CVS and get clocked. It could happen, but for now, at this point, it has not, and I'm really grateful for that. Your other question was about correcting the record, and I have to admit, I didn't go into this book thinking I needed to correct the record, because I was already writing pieces of it before I had the whole story. But when I saw those newspapers, I knew that it had to be in the book, that I needed the opportunity to correct the record. And it's interesting because the newspapers actually tell on themselves in their own racism, right? After the third time you see comma Negro, you know what you're not reading, right? An unbiased version of this. And so they kind of tell on themselves, it's built in some ways. No one would read that and think, well, this is an unbiased account of what happened in this accident, in part because the whole newspaper is a record of white supremacy in journalism. But I also felt the need to correct it for a cousin of mine who was the child who survived the accident. She was 7 years old. She has no memory of that. And she also had no memory of her parents before, because they were killed in the accident, and her sister was as well. And I didn't know that she didn't have a memory of it until I finally broached this with her. I took my dad with me to talk to her about this for the first time. And I really felt like I could be trespassing. And then to find out that both the traumatic experience, but also relatives telling her, don't ever mention this, don't ever talk about this, it was gone. And I thought it was necessary to have that conversation in the book, because I wanted to be able to fill in some of those gaps for her. Just the thought of being 7 years old and then having no memory of your parents. But that it wasn't an accident. It wasn't just the trauma of the accident. It was people around her who had no way of processing what had happened, deciding that they would pretend that it hadn't happened. So to me, the book was necessary in some ways to correct that record. That's a great way of thinking about it. I really appreciate that.
Okay, got time for one more question. Anybody else? Oh, right here.
I have two questions for you. Has your book been reviewed?
Yes.
Do I express something? Hold the microphone. Two questions for you. Has your book been reviewed in the town? And the other question is, I haven't read your book. Were you able to ask your father why he named you after the niece and not his mom or sister?
Yes. So yes to the second one, and he was not the one who named me, it was my mother, which is very interesting to me, that it was her. And she loved telling the story about naming me because she saw that name as a kind of gift to my father. Which is interesting because I do feel like she was very good at engaging in the kind of repression that kept my father standing, and yet that was like my name was sort of a token in a way. And it was one of the few ways in which what had happened was being acknowledged in this sort of day-to-day way. And she always says, well, I really like the name. And then she would say that, but it's very clearly when she would tell the story that she'd be grinning the whole time, like, look what I did for him, as a way of acknowledging and coping with the grief. And so there's that. I don't think it has been, because I think I would have heard from some people from home if it had been. And not everybody there reads the New York Times, so I'm pretty sure. I don't think it has been. I did worry about that as well, though, because I do talk a lot about like my teenage years and the ways in which Black girlhood was defined as this sort of state of already being pregnant, and so I talk a lot about that in the book, and I have wondered if some friends from high school might be troubled by having written about our sort of interior life in some way. But obviously I've decided to be okay with that if they did, they weren't. But no, it hasn't been as far as I know. It's very interesting to me though how separate our worlds are in that way. Like we're just in New Jersey, but in some ways it feels like we're like a world away from Alabama. In my mind now.
You go back to Alabama frequently or very infrequently at this point?
I used to go more frequently when my dad was living. He adored my girls, my kids, and I went much more frequently than I go now. It's kind of a difficult trip to make, in part because we live in a place with poor infrastructures, and so I could barely fly into Alabama without it being extremely costly. I usually fly into Tennessee and then drive down. But we probably go anywhere from 3 to 4 times a year for a really long time.
One more question.
You somewhat alluded to this in the answering the last question, but my question is about the wreck itself. You haven't really spoken about were other people involved? How did it happen? Who was driving? Who was guilty? And then were people upset about the wreck? And did their blame transfer to you later on? What were the effects of this on you later on because of the wreck itself? You haven't talked about the wreck.
Yeah, that's because I want you to buy the book. The book business. But it's a really good question because, one of the things I do write about in the book is the fact that we had been crossing over the site where it happened over and over again when I was a kid, and no one ever said anything. And it wasn't until I started talking to my dad about it that we were coming from that cousin's house that I was just telling you about. He goes, oh, and this is where it happened. And in short, I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. In short, there was a construction site that had not been ordered off properly, it hadn't been marked carefully. And it was a situation where what was normally 4 lanes had gone down to 2. And a white couple was behind my family traveling in a sports car, and they were trying to get around them. And they did not realize that that the lanes had been taken down to 2, and they hit a dump truck head on that was coming over the hill, and that car was then pushed into the car my family was in. Yeah, exactly. And so, because they were going uphill when they tried to pass. And yeah, it was devastating, and the couple was killed. The person in the dump truck survived and was taken to the same hospital that my family went to. But yeah, it was utterly devastating. And I will tell you this as well. My father ended up at the scene because he was told to go to the wrong hospital. I think we forget how much confusion segregation caused. Like, he gets a call at work saying, you know, your family's been in an accident, and they tell him to go to a different hospital. And he, which then takes him to the site where the accident had happened. And it was, you know, people were standing everywhere, and he has to get out of the car at the scene, and someone says to him, oh no, your family was taken in that ambulance that went that way. And he had to turn around and go back. So yeah, it was devastating. And also, I have to say, when you read a newspaper from that period of time, it's like a list of car accidents too. You realize, like, you know, seatbelts, all of these, you know, sort of, you know, efforts towards safety, speed limits are high. Like, there's a lot of possibilities for what could happen in a situation like that, and very little was being really sort of regulated in terms of vehicle safety at the time.
Cassandra, thank you so much. This is a really beautiful memoir, and I love the, you know, it's heartbreaking to read, and it's got so much depth to it. And I want to thank you for taking the courage to research it and write it, and to just, you know, lay bare your honesty in it. It's really spectacular. So we do have copies here for sale, and Cassandra will sign them. And we usually take more of a break in the summer here at the library, our author events, but we had some really good possibilities come our way. So we're going to be doing some more book brunches. You should watch out for those, including the end of July on the 30th. We'll have Claire LeGrand here, a totally different genre than this. But Claire used to work here at the library, as she's also a very well-known author of fantasy books, mostly for young adults. This is her first adult novel. So if you would like reading fantasy, you'll want to come see Claire. And then also, Tuesday, June 20th, we're having Lisa Belkin here, and her book is called Genealogy of a Murder. And it's, if you look around, it's like a must read of the summer, and it's set in Connecticut. It's around the murder of a policeman there and how it affects 3 families through generations. It's a true crime. And it kind of has that uncovering of the past, because it happened in the 60s in Connecticut. Lisa Belkin has quite a stellar career herself. So we have her coming, and we have a few others in there. But so keep your eye out on the library e-newsletter and for further author events this summer. But again, thank you, Cassandra. This has been really fabulous.